The silence didn't arrive all at once. It settled in stages, like a massive machine losing its momentum. Arthur was 3 levels below the waterline in the pump room of the Persephone, a semi-submersible drilling platform situated in a lonely, deep-water corridor of the North Sea. He was 54 years old, a man of precise habits and a deep, instinctual understanding of fluid dynamics. At that moment, his world was the size of a manifold. He was replacing a high-pressure seal on a backup desalination pump, his wrench moving in a practiced, rhythmic arc. The only sound was accompanying industrial roar of the main gas turbines far above, a 40-megawatt heartbeat that kept the rig alive. To anyone else, the noise of a drilling rig was a chaotic cacophony, but to Arthur, it was a symphony of health. He could hear the distinct whine of the centrifugal separators, the rhythmic thud of the mud pumps, and the low-frequency hum of the transformers. He worked in the gray room, a space characterized by the smell of ozone, hydraulic fluid, and the faint, metallic tang of salt air that managed to seep through even the most airtight seals. He was tightening the last of the grade 8 bolts on the pump housing when the first anomaly occurred. It was a frequency shift, not a loss of power, but a change in the vibration. The wrench in his hand suddenly felt dead. The high-pitched sing of the turbine generators began to slide down the scale, losing its sharp edge. It was the sound of mechanical heart skipping a beat. Arthur froze, his head tilted toward the ceiling. He counted the seconds. In a standard load-shedding event, the automated systems would have kicked in within 3 seconds to balance the grid. 3 seconds passed. 5, 10. The slide continued. The deep, chest-thumping bass of the turbines began to moan, a hollow, metallic sound like a dying animal. Then, with a final, shuddering thrum that vibrated the very marrow of his bones, the power vanished. The gray room plunged into a darkness so absolute it felt physical. The only light came from the faint, glowing phosphorus of the manual pressure gauges and the dying embers of a single LED on the pump's control panel. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing against Arthur's eardrums with the weight of the thousands of tons of seawater just a few feet away on the other side of the concrete hull. "Control, this is Arthur," he said, reaching for the radio on his belt. His voice sounded thin, stripped of the mechanical backdrop he had lived in for the last 3 weeks. "We've got a total flameout in the subcellar. Status on the main bus." He waited for the crackle of the squelch. He waited for Miller, the rig manager, to offer a sarcastic comment about Arthur's luck. There was nothing, not even the white noise of an open channel. Arthur didn't move for a full minute. He practiced a breathing technique he'd learned decades ago on his first offshore assignment. For seconds in, for seconds out. It kept the carbon dioxide levels in the blood steady, preventing the engineer's panic, the frantic, illogical jumping from one task to another. He reached into his thigh pocket and pulled out his primary flashlight, a ruggedized LED torch. He clicked it on. The beam was a sharp, narrow blade that cut through the gloom, reflecting off the polished steel of the pipes and the damp concrete of the floor. He walked to the main bulkhead phone, a hardwired analog system designed to work even when the digital comms failed. He lifted the heavy receiver. No dial tone. No hum. It was a dead loop. "Right," he whispered to the empty room. "First things first. Physics doesn't change." He began to climb. The Persephone was designed as a smart rig, a prototype for the next generation of autonomous resource extraction. It was a vertical city of steel and concrete, standing on 4 massive hollow legs that acted as ballast tanks. Arthur was currently in the foot of leg Alpha. To get to the surface, he had to ascend nearly 200 feet of vertical steel ladders. The climb was a lesson in the rig's anatomy. On a normal day, the ladders were warm to the touch, vibrating with the energy of the pipes running alongside them. Now, the steel was cold. The air was becoming stagnant. As he passed level 2, the ballast control deck, He paused and looked through the small, reinforced porthole. The emergency lighting, which was supposed to be triggered by a series of independent battery backups, was dark. This was impossible. The batteries were kept in a nitrogen purge room on the mezzanine, checked weekly. For them to fail meant either a catastrophic physical surge or a software wipe of the entire master control logic. He reached the spider deck, the open-air grate system directly beneath the main living quarters. Here, the silence of the rig met the roar of the ocean. Usually, the Persephone was bathed in the orange glow of 1,000 floodlights, making it a beacon in the North Sea. Now it was a ghost. The wind was a steady, biting 30 knots, smelling of cold salt and old iron. Arthur stepped out onto the grating, his flashlight beam disappearing into the vast, churning gray of the Atlantic. Below, he looked up at the derrick. The massive steel tower, normally the center of a frenetic dance of light and motion, was a jagged skeleton against the stars. He moved toward the south gantry. This was the location of the Aegir 1, the rig's primary escape capsule. It was a high-tech sphere designed to withstand a fall from the deck and survive in the water for 30 days. The gantry was empty. Arthur shone his light on the docking clamps. They hadn't been triggered by the emergency release. The heavy hydraulic pins had been pulled manually. The umbilical cables, which provided power and air to the pod while it sat in its cradle, hadn't been disconnected. They had been hacked through with a fire axe. The frayed ends of the copper wiring sparkled faintly in his light, coated in a fine layer of sea spray. "Miller? Sarah?" he called out. The wind caught his words and tore them away instantly. He moved toward the living quarters, his boots clanging on the steel deck, a sound that seemed to echo forever in the hollow structure. He pushed through the pressurized door into the mess hall. The scene inside was frozen in time. A tray of food sat on the counter. A laptop was open on one of the tables, its screen dark, a half-finished cup of coffee beside it. There were no signs of a struggle, no frantic packing. It looked as if the other two crew members had simply stood up and walked into the sea. Arthur walked to the wide, panoramic windows of the bridge. This was the highest point on the rig, offering a 360-degree view of the horizon. He didn't look at the rig's consoles first. He looked at the world. To the west, the Scottish coast should have been a line of amber light. Even on the foggiest nights, the glow of Aberdeen and the surrounding industrial hubs was visible as a faint dome of light on the horizon. There was nothing. The horizon was a hard, black line where the dark sea met a darker sky. He turned to the south, looking for the lights of the neighboring rigs, Goliath and Deepwater 9. They were gone, too. It was as if someone had reached out and pinched a wick of every candle in the world. Arthur sat in the captain's chair. The leather was still warm. He pulled a small, tattered notebook from his breast pocket, a habit from his days as an apprentice. He laid it on the console, clicked his pen, and looked at his watch. Log entry 01. Time 21:42. Location Persephone Alpha. He paused, his hand hovering over the paper. He was an engineer. He dealt in variables, loads, and pressures. He didn't deal in blackouts that erase entire countries. Events, he wrote. Total power loss at 2104. Turbines spun down in a non-standard deceleration. All primary and secondary comms are dark. All emergency battery backups have failed to engage. The Aegir. One pod has been deployed manually. I am the only remaining crew member on site. He looked at the words. They were too clinical, too small for the reality of the situation. He looked back out at the window. The North Sea was a graveyard of cold water. Observation, he added, his handwriting slightly more jagged. The mainland is dark. No coastal beacons. No satellite transit visible in the upper atmosphere. The great quiet has begun. He closed a notebook and stood up. He couldn't solve the mystery of why the world had gone dark, but he could solve the mystery of why his rig was cold. He was a Persephone's keeper. If the power stayed off, the heaters in the ballast tanks would fail. If the ballast froze or the sensors glitched, the rig could tilt. If it tilted, it would capsize. He didn't have time to be a survivor. He had to be an engineer. He turned toward the stairwell that led to the battery mezzanine. He had to figure out how to bypass the master logic and trick the batteries into giving up their charge. He had 1,000 tons of steel to keep afloat, and the ocean was already beginning to feel the absence of the rig's heat. As he stepped back into the stairwell, he heard it for the first time. It wasn't a roar or a scream. It was a low-frequency pulse coming from the very bottom of the rig, miles below the seafloor. Thump. It was the sound of something heavy hitting the drill string. Thump. Arthur gripped the railing, his knuckles white. He looked down into the darkness of the center column. The sound was rhythmic. It was patient, and it was coming from a place where nothing was supposed to be alive. Arthur stood frozen on the stairs, his ears straining to isolate the source of the vibration. The thump wasn't mechanical. It lacked the sharp, metallic ping of a failing valve or a loose piston. It was a dull, organic percussion, felt more in the soles of his feet than heard in the air. He checked the depth gauge on the bulkhead. The drill string extended nearly 3 miles into the crust of the North Sea floor. Down there, the pressure was over 15,000 pounds per square inch. Nothing should be hitting anything. He forced himself to turn away from the dark shaft. Investigating the sea floor was a task for an ROV. And without power, the drones were just expensive paperweights in their docking bays. He had to prioritize the living. He reached the battery mezzanine, a narrow, climate-controlled corridor lined with racks of deep-cycle lithium iron phosphate cells. The air here was usually kept at a crisp 20 degrees Celsius to optimize battery life, but it was already dropping. He opened the main junction box, the beam of his flashlight illuminating a nightmare of scorched copper and melted plastic. Someone didn't just pull the plug, Arthur whispered, his voice catching in the dry air. He leaned in closer. The main bus bars, thick strips of copper that carried the rig's lifeblood, had been intentionally shorted. Someone had bridged the terminals with a heavy-duty grounding cable. It wasn't an accident. It was a scuttle. Miller and Sarah hadn't just fled. They had tried to kill the rig before they left. He spent the next hour in a state of hyper-focused labor. He used a hacksaw to cut away the melted segments of the bus bar, his movements slow and methodical to conserve the oxygen in the cooling room. He had to bypass the digital controllers entirely, hot-wiring the batteries directly to the emergency lighting and the heater in the galley. When the first dim, amber bulb flickered to life in the hallway, Arthur didn't cheer. He just wiped the grease from his forehead and looked at the clock. It was nearly midnight. He was exhausted, cold, and alone on a tomb of steel, but the Persephone was breathing again, however faintly. He stepped out onto the gantry one last time before retreating to the galley, looking once more at the empty horizon. The world was still gone, but for now, his island was still afloat. The first week of the Great Quiet was defined by a brutal, technical clarity. Arthur had always believed that a man's sanity was tied directly to his routine, and on the Persephone, routine was the only thing preventing the vast, gray Atlantic from swallowing his mind. He woke every morning at 4:30, long before the sun managed to pierce the thick, salt-heavy mist of the North Sea. His living quarters, once a climate-controlled sanctuary, had become a cold, damp cell. To save the precious DC voltage in his jerry-rigged battery bank, he had cut the heaters in the sleeping quarters. He slept in layers of thermal wool and a heavy-duty immersion suit, his breath blooming in the air like pale ghosts. The first task of the day was the power audit. Arthur sat at the small galley table, his notebook open, a manual slide rule resting beside his lukewarm tea. He didn't use a calculator. He didn't want to waste a battery. He had to calculate the solar gain versus the base load. The rig's main gas turbines were dead, and the fuel lines were airlocked. His only source of life was the sky. "Input," he whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. 6 portable 400-watt monocrystalline panels, wired in parallel to the 24-volt bus. Nominal output in overcast conditions, approximately 30%. He scribbled the numbers. He was only pulling in about 700 watts during the peak of the day, barely enough to keep the emergency sensors active and the desalination unit running for an hour. If he wanted to survive the winter, he needed more. He needed to turn the Persephone into a giant steel sun catcher. He spent the next 4 days on the exterior catwalks, 120 feet above the water. The wind was a constant, punishing force that numbed his fingers and made every bolt turn a struggle. He began a process he called the solar harvest. He moved through the rig like a scavenger, stripping the solar-powered navigation buoys from their cradles and unscrewing the small panels from the lifeboat roofs. The work was dangerous and slow. He had to build custom mounting brackets out of scrap aluminum and L-beams he salvaged from the machine shop. He described the process in his log with the meticulousness of an instructional manual. "To ensure maximum tension against the North Sea gusts, I am utilizing 12mm stainless steel bolts with nylon locking nuts. The panels are angled at 55 degrees to account for the low winter sun at this latitude." By the 5th day, the south-facing side of the drilling derrick looked like a jagged, black wing. 22 mismatched solar panels were bolted to the girders, their wires trailing down like copper vines into a central charge controller he had salvaged from a defunct weather station. When he finally flipped the switch, he didn't feel a rush of triumph. He felt a sense of equilibrium. The digital voltmeter on his makeshift dashboard climbed from 23.2 to 26.8 volts. The Persephone was no longer dying. She was holding her breath. But as the power stabilized, the silence of the rig became more profound. Without the roar of the engines, the sounds of the ocean became intimate. He could hear the water sloshing inside the hollow concrete legs, a deep, rhythmic gulping sound that felt like the breathing of Leviathan. On the 6th night, while he was in the machine shop sharpening the blade of a manual handsaw, the signal returned. It started as a high-pitched whine in his headphones. He had been trying to scan the radio frequencies, hoping to find a stray broadcast from a government bunker or a passing ship. But there were no voices. There was only a rhythmic digital pulse. Dit-dit-dash. Dit-dit-dash. It wasn't Morse code. It was a data burst, a dense, compressed packet of information. Arthur adjusted the squelch on the radio. The signal wasn't coming from the sky. He rotated the directional antenna, watching the signal strength meter on his old analog oscilloscope. The needle spiked when the antenna pointed straight down. From the well, Arthur murmured, the chill in the room suddenly feeling much sharper. He moved to the floor grating and looked down into the moon pool, the square opening in the center of the rig, where the drill string entered the sea. The water down there was black and churned into a white froth by the wind. The 3-mile-long steel pipe reached down into the dark, connecting the rig to the Earth's crust. The pulse was traveling up the steel. It was using the drill string as a massive antenna. Arthur spent the next several hours trying to decode the burst. He hooked the radio output to an old thermal plotter, watching as the machine spat out long strips of paper covered in jagged geometric patterns. It looked like a seismic map, but it was too organized. It had the symmetry of a heartbeat. He lay in his bunk that night, the strips of paper spread out over his wool blankets. He thought about the global blackout. He thought about the mainland going dark in a single hour. If the disaster was digital, a virus or a coordinated hack, the rigs would be the last nodes left. They were the fingers of civilization reaching into the deep. Just as he was drifting into a fitful sleep, a new sound echoed through the superstructure. Clang. It was the sound of a heavy steel door closing on level 3. Arthur sat bolt upright, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy pipe wrench he kept by his bed. Level 3 was the spider deck. It was an open-air level. There were no doors on level 3 that could close on their own. The wind could howl through the pipes, and the waves could slam against the hull, but the heavy, pressurized fire doors required a human hand to pull them shut against their hydraulic rams. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out into the hallway. The air was dead still. He began the descent, his boots making no sound on the rubber-matted stairs. When he reached level 3, he stopped. The beam of his light swept across the wet, salty deck. The fire door leading to the emergency generator room was closed. He remembered leaving it open to let the salt air dry out the damp wiring. He approached the door, his heart hammering against his ribs in a slow, heavy rhythm. He gripped the handle. It was warm. In a world of 0 degrees, the steel handle felt like it had been held by a living hand. He pulled the door open. The room was empty. The smell of old diesel and cold copper was the only thing that greeted him. But as he turned to leave, his light caught something on the floor. It was a puddle of water, not sea spray, a concentrated pool of dark, oily liquid, as if someone or something had stood there for a long time, dripping. Arthur knelt and touched the fluid. It was cold. It wasn't oil. It was a fine, gray silt, the kind of mud found only at the very bottom of the ocean floor, 3 miles down. He looked at the gray smear on his fingertip. Then he looked at the closed door. "Miller," he whispered. The only answer was the dit-dit dash of the signal pulsing the radio on his belt, growing louder, more insistent, as if it were finally being heard. He realized then that the great quiet wasn't a lack of sound. It was an invitation. The world hadn't gone dark because of failure. It had gone dark to make room for something else. Arthur retreated to the bridge and locked the heavy security door. He spent the rest of the night watching the CCTV monitors, his eyes burning with exhaustion. On the level 3 camera, a small, gray handprint was visible on the white-painted steel of the door. It was too small to be Miller's, and it had too many fingers. Arthur's log entry for day 8 was short. The solar arrays are holding. The battery bank is at 80%. I am no longer alone on the Persephone. Something has climbed the drill string. It is cold, it is patient, and it is waiting for the sun to go down. He spent the following morning reinforcing the internal hatches. He didn't use locks. Locks could be picked or bypassed by anyone with engineering knowledge. Instead, he used welder's logic. He took his portable plasma torch and spot welded the hinges of every non-essential door. He turned the living quarters into a steel box. He knew he was trapping himself, but as he looked out at the vast, empty ocean, he realized that the Persephone was the only place left in the world where the rules of physics still made sense. If he stayed inside the steel, if he kept the lights on, he might survive the transition. But the solar panels only worked when there was light. And the North Sea winters were famous for their weeks of endless, heavy fog. As the sun began to dip below the horizon on day 9, a thick, yellow mist began to roll in from the east. It swallowed the derrick. It swallowed the solar panels. And for the first time since the blackout, the voltmeter on Arthur's dashboard began to drop. 26.2, 25.9, 25.5. He sat in the captain's chair, the pipe wrench across his lap, listening to the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of something heavy climbing the exterior ladder toward the bridge. The guests had arrived. The first week of the Great Quiet was defined by a brutal, technical clarity. Arthur had always believed that a man's sanity was tied directly to his routine, and on the Persephone, routine was the only thing preventing the vast, gray Atlantic from swallowing his mind. He woke every morning at 4:30, long before the sun managed to pierce the thick, salt-heavy mist of the North Sea. His living quarters, once a climate-controlled sanctuary, had become a cold, damp cell to save the precious DC voltage in his jerry-rigged battery bank. He had cut the heaters in the sleeping quarters. He slept in layers of thermal wool and a heavy-duty immersion suit, his breath blooming in the air like pale ghosts. The first task of the day was the power audit. Arthur sat at the small galley table, his notebook open, a manual slide rule resting beside his lukewarm tea. He didn't use a calculator. He didn't want to waste a battery. He had to calculate the solar gain versus the base load. The rig's main gas turbines were dead, and the fuel lines were airlocked. His only source of life was the sky. Input, he whispered, his voice raspy from disuse. 6 portable 400-watt monocrystalline panels, wired in parallel to the 24-volt bus. Nominal output in overcast conditions, approximately 30%. He scribbled the numbers. He was only pulling in about 700 watts during the peak of the day, barely enough to keep the emergency sensors active and the desalination unit running for an hour. If he wanted to survive the winter, he needed more. He needed to turn Persephone into a giant steel sun catcher. He spent the next 4 days on the exterior catwalks, 120 feet above the water. The wind was a constant, punishing force that numbed his fingers and made every bolt turn a struggle. He began a process he called the solar harvest. He moved through the rig like a scavenger, stripping the solar-powered navigation buoys from their cradles and unscrewing the small panels from the lifeboat roofs. The work was dangerous and slow. He had to build custom mounting brackets out of scrap aluminum and L-beams he salvaged from the machine shop. He described the process in his log with the meticulousness of an instructional manual. To ensure maximum tension against the North Sea gusts, I am utilizing 12mm stainless steel bolts with nylon locking nuts. The panels are angled at 55 degrees to account for the low winter sun at this latitude. By the 5th day, the south-facing side of the drilling derrick looked like a jagged black wing. 22 mismatched solar panels were bolted to the girders, their wires trailing down like copper vines into a central charge controller he had salvaged from a defunct weather station. When he finally flipped the switch, he didn't feel a rush of triumph. He felt a sense of equilibrium. The digital voltmeter on his makeshift dashboard climbed from 23.2 to 26.8 volts. The Persephone was no longer dying. She was holding her breath. But as the power stabilized, the silence of the rig became more profound. Without the roar of the engines, the sound of the ocean became intimate. He could hear the water sloshing inside the hollow concrete legs, a deep, rhythmic gulping sound that felt like the breathing of Leviathan. On the 6th night, while he was in the machine shop sharpening the blade of a manual handsaw, the signal returned. It started as a high-pitched whine in his headphones. He had been trying to scan the radio frequencies, hoping to find a stray broadcast from a government bunker or a passing ship. But there were no voices. There was only a rhythmic digital pulse. Dit-dit-dash, dit-dit-dash. It wasn't Morse code. It was a data burst, a dense, compressed packet of information. Arthur adjusted the squelch on the radio. The signal wasn't coming from the sky. He rotated the directional antenna, watching the signal strength meter on his old analog oscilloscope. The needle spiked when the antenna pointed straight down. From the well, Arthur murmured, the chill in the room suddenly feeling much sharper. He moved to the floor grating and looked down into the moon pool, the square opening in the center of the rig where the drill string entered the sea. The water down there was black and churned into a white froth by the wind. The 3-mile-long steel pipe reached down into the dark, connecting the rig to the Earth's crust. The pulse was traveling up the steel. It was using the drill string as a massive antenna. Arthur spent the next several hours trying to decode the burst. He hooked the radio output to an old thermal plotter, watching as the machine spat out long strips of paper covered in jagged geometric patterns. It looked like a seismic map, but it was too organized. It had the symmetry of a heartbeat. He lay in his bunk that night, the strips of paper spread out over his wool blankets. He thought about the global blackout. He thought about the mainland going dark in a single hour. If the disaster was digital, a virus or a coordinated hack, the rigs would be the last nodes left. They were the fingers of civilization reaching into the deep. Just as he was drifting into a fitful sleep, a new sound echoed through the superstructure. Clang. It was the sound of a heavy steel door closing on level 3. Arthur sat bolt upright, his hand instinctively reaching for the heavy pipe wrench he kept by his bed. Level 3 was the spider deck. It was an open-air level. There were no doors on level 3 that could close on their own. The wind could howl through the pipes, and the waves would slam against the hull, but the heavy, pressurized fire doors required a human hand to pull them shut against their hydraulic rams. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out into the hallway. The air was dead still. He began the descent, his boots making no sound on the rubber-matted stairs. When he reached level 3, he stopped. The beam of his light swept across the wet, salty deck. The fire door leading to the emergency generator room was closed. He remembered leaving it open to let the salt air dry out the damp wiring. He approached the door, his heart hammering against his ribs in a slow, heavy rhythm. He gripped the handle. It was warm. In a world of 0 degrees, the steel handle felt like it had been held by a living hand. He pulled the door open. The room was empty. The smell of old diesel and cold copper was the only thing that greeted him. But as he turned to leave, his light caught something on the floor. It was a puddle of water, not sea spray, a concentrated pool of dark, oily liquid, as if someone or something had stood there for a long time, dripping. Arthur knelt and touched the fluid. It was cold. It wasn't oil. It was a fine, gray silt, the kind of mud found only at the very bottom of the ocean floor, 3 miles down. He looked at the gray smear on his fingertip. Then he looked at the closed door. "Miller," he whispered. The only answer was the dit-dit dash of the signal pulsing in the radio on his belt, growing louder, more insistent, as if it were finally being heard. He realized then that the great quiet wasn't a lack of sound. It was an invitation. The world hadn't gone dark because of failure. It had gone dark to make room for something else. Arthur retreated to the bridge and locked the heavy security door. He spent the rest of the night watching the CCTV monitors, his eyes burning with exhaustion. On the level 3 camera, a small, gray handprint was visible on the white painted steel of the door. It was too small to be Miller's, and it had too many fingers. Arthur's log entry for day 8 was short. The solar arrays are holding. The battery bank is at 80%. I am no longer alone on the Persephone. Something has climbed the drill string. It is cold, it is patient, and it is waiting for the sun to go down. He spent the following morning reinforcing the internal hatches. He didn't use locks. Locks could be picked or bypassed by anyone with engineering knowledge. Instead, he used welder's logic. He took his portable plasma torch and spot welded the hinges of every non-essential door. He turned the living quarters into a steel box. He knew he was trapping himself, but as he looked out at the vast, empty ocean, he realized that the Persephone was the only place left in the world where the rules of physics still made sense. If he stayed inside the steel, if he kept the lights on, he might survive the transition. But the solar panels only worked when there was light, and the North Sea winters were famous for their weeks of endless, heavy fog. As the sun began to dip below the horizon on day 9, a thick, yellow mist began to roll in from the east. It swallowed the derrick. It swallowed the solar panels. And for the first time since the blackout, the voltmeter on Arthur's dashboard began to drop. 26.2, 25.9, 25.5. He sat in the captain's chair, the pipe wrench across his lap, listening to the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of something heavy climbing the exterior ladder toward the bridge. The guests had arrived. The darkness that followed the total depletion of the battery bank was not merely an absence of light. It was a physical weight. On the Persephone, darkness meant the end of the mechanical barriers between Arthur and the North Sea. Without electricity, the magnetic locks on the inner bulkheads lost their grip, the heaters in the pipes ceased their struggle against the frost, and the silence of the guests outside the window became the dominant frequency of the world. Arthur sat in the captain's chair for a full hour after the voltmeter hit zero. He didn't move. He didn't breathe heavily. He waited for the sound of shattering glass or the hiss of the bridge door being forced open. Neither came. The gym suit, the hulking, silt-stained relic from the deep, simply remained pressed against the window, its green CRT face casting a rhythmic emerald pulse against the frosted glass, ready for upload. "Not today," Arthur whispered. He reached into his utility belt and pulled out a chemical light stick, a glow stick. He snapped it. The sharp crack of the internal glass vial sounded like a gunshot in the dead air. A neon green radiance bled into the room, illuminating the frost that was already starting to lace the edges of the control consoles. He had to move. The bridge was a glass cage, and the temperature was dropping at a rate of 1 degree every 10 minutes. If he stayed, he would freeze. If he went down, he had to pass the guest. Arthur knew the rig's blueprints better than he knew the lines on his own palms. He didn't need the main elevators or the primary stairwells. He moved to the corner of the bridge and pulled back a section of the heavy industrial carpeting, revealing a circular brass hatch. It was a maintenance drop, a narrow vertical tube containing a single ladder and a cluster of hydraulic lines that led directly to the level 4 life support deck. He eased himself into the hole, the cold metal of the ladder biting through his gloves. As he descended, he could hear the rig moaning. Without the stabilizing influence of the computer-controlled ballast pumps, the Persephone was beginning to list slightly to the northeast, leaning into prevailing swell. It was a tilt of perhaps 2 degrees, barely noticeable to a landsman, but to Arthur it felt like the world was sliding off its axis. He reached level 4 and stepped out into the hydroponic deck. Before the blackout, this area had been an experimental project by Sarah, the rig's biologist. It was a long, narrow gallery lined with PVC piping and nutrient-rich water tanks, designed to test if a skeleton crew could supplement their rations with fresh greens. Now, it was a graveyard of withered spinach and dead lettuce. Arthur's flashlight beam swept across the room. This was his new objective. To survive, he didn't just need power. He needed calories. And to get calories, he had to resurrect the gray water system. Step 1. Filtration, he muttered, his breath forming a thick cloud in the green light. He moved to the primary reservoir. The water inside was stagnant, covered in a thin layer of oily film. It was a gray water from the rig's showers and sinks, pre-filtered but still full of bacteria and soap residue. To make it viable for the plants, he had to build a bio-column. He spent the next 5 hours in a state of technical trance. He found several empty 5-gallon buckets in the janitorial closet. He used his soldering iron, powered by a small hand-cranked emergency dynamo, to melt holes in the bottom of each bucket. Then he began the stack. He filled the first bucket with coarse gravel salvage from the rig's decorative planters in the lobby. The second bucket he filled with sand from the fire suppression bins. For the third, he went to a machine shop and gathered bags of crushed charcoal, which was used in the rig's air-scrubbing units. He stacked them one on top of the other, creating a vertical gravity filter. The physics of the sand filter is a matter of surface area, Arthur said, his voice a low drone to keep the silence at bay. The charcoal absorbs the toxins. The sand traps the particulates. It's a slow process, 2 liters per hour, but it's clean. He began the slow process of hand pouring the stagnant gray water into the top of his tower. He watched as the murky liquid disappeared into the gravel. Minutes later, a clear, slow drip began to pitter-patter into the collection tub at the bottom. Drip, drip, drip. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. It was the sound of a system working. But as he sat on the floor, watching his filter, the signal began to vibrate to the floorboards again. This time, it wasn't a radio pulse. It was physical, a low-frequency thrumming that made the water in the collection tub ripple in perfect, concentric circles. Dit-dit-dish. Arthur looked at the ripples. They weren't random. They were forming geometric shapes, hexagons that shifted into triangles and then back again. The signal was no longer just data. It was becoming a physical force, a vibration tuned to the resonant frequency of water. He stood up, his knees aching. He moved to the far end of the hydroponic deck, where a series of large, clear plastic windows looked down into the moon pool. The moon pool was a 40-foot square opening in the center of the deck, giving the crew a direct view of the sea surface beneath the rig. Normally, it was a churn of white foam and dark blue water. Now it was glowing, far beneath the surface, miles down where the drills streamed at the seabed. A soft, pulsating blue light was climbing the pipe. It looked like a neon liquid, a bioluminescent sap rising from the earth itself. It moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, inching upward toward the Persephone. It's a conductor, Arthur realized. The drill string wasn't just a pipe anymore. It was a straw, and something in the deep was using it to pull itself up. The vibration intensified. A shelf of Sarah's old seed packets fell to the floor, spilling hundreds of tiny, black grains across the deck. Arthur watched in horror as the seeds began to move. They didn't roll, they marched. They were being drawn toward the water reservoir, pulled by the same magnetic or frequency base force that was driving the ripples in the bucket. He scrambled his feet and grabbed a heavy crowbar. He had to disconnect the hydroponic deck from the main structural supports of the rig. If the signal reached his water supply, his plants, his only source of life, would become part of whatever was climbing the pipe. He began to smash the plastic PVC pipes, breaking the connections to the main water lines. He worked with frantic, desperate energy, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He was an engineer fighting against a new kind of physics, a biotic engineering that he didn't understand. Just as he broke the last pipe, the door at the end of the hallway groaned. It wasn't the guest in the gym suit. This sound was different. It was a wet, squelching sound of something soft moving over steel. Arthur turned his flashlight toward the door. A thin, gray tendril of silk-covered matter was snaking through the gap in the door frame. It looked like a root, but it was moving with the grace of an octopus tentacle. It was searching the floor, its tip vibrating in sync with the dip-bit dash of the signal. It found the puddle of filtered water at the bottom of Arthur's bio-column. The moment the tendril touched the water, it turned a brilliant, pulsing blue. The water in the tub didn't just sit there. It rose. It defied gravity, climbing up the tendril in a spiraling vortex, being absorbed into the gray mass. Arthur backed away, his boots slipping on the spilled seeds. The tendril grew thicker, stronger, as it drank his filtered water. It began to pulse with a heartbeat, the same heartbeat Arthur had felt in the subcellar on the first night. "You're not an upload," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling. "You're a harvest." He realized then that the blackout hadn't been an accident of technology. It had been a clearance. The world had been emptied so that this prehistoric hydraulic life form could reclaim the surface. It needed the rigs as stepping stones, using the steel structures to bridge the gap between the high-pressure abyss and the air. He looked at his bio-column. His hours of work were being undone in seconds. The creature was drinking the only clean water he had. He had to make a choice. He could run, or he could poison the well. Arthur lunged to the chemical locker. He grabbed a 2-gallon jug of concentrated copper sulfate, an algaseed used to keep the rig's external cooling vents clear of barnacles. It was a potent toxin to anything biological. He unscrewed the cap and dumped the entire jug into the top of the bio column. "Drink this," he hissed. The blue light in the tendril flared to a blinding, electric violet. The creature let out a sound that Arthur felt in his teeth, a high-frequency shriek that shattered the glass windows of the hydroponic deck. The tendril whipped back, thrashing against the steel bulkheads with enough force to dent the metal. It turned a sickly, bruised black and dissolved into a puddle of foul-smelling sludge. The vibration in the floor stopped. The blue light in the moon pool faded back into the depths. Arthur collapsed against the wall, his heart racing. He was covered in gray silt and copper sulfate. His water was ruined. His garden was a wreck. But as he looked at the dead, black puddle on the floor, he felt a grim sense of satisfaction. He had won the first round. He checked his watch. 3 o'clock. The sun would be up in a few hours. He needed to get to the T-top of the derrick to check his solar panels. If the creature was using the rig's internal wiring to travel, he had to isolate his power grid completely. He had to go off-grid within his own rig. He picked up his crowbar and his flashlight. He was exhausted, hungry, and his hands were shaking from the cold, but his mind was clear. He was an engineer. He would fix the pipes. He would filter the water again, and he would keep the Persephone above the waves, no matter what crawled out of the dark to claim her. As he climbed the ladder toward the derrick, he looked out the broken window. The fog was starting to lift, and there on the horizon, he saw it. It wasn't a ship. It was another rig, the Goliath 7, 10 miles to the south. It was glowing blue. Arthur watched as a massive bioluminescent stalk, thick as a redwood tree, rose from the center of the Goliath and reached toward the clouds. It was a spore tower, a bridge between the ocean and the sky. "They're not just surfacing," Arthur whispered, the horror finally sinking in. "They're blooming." He turned and began to climb faster. He didn't just need to survive anymore. He needed to find a way to burn the garden down. The realization that the guest was not a solitary interloper, but merely the first of a 1,000-strong maintenance crew from the abyss, changed the fundamental calculus of Arthur's survival. He was no longer maintaining a rig. He was defending a breach. As he descended the derrick, his boots ringing hollowly against the salt-encrusted steel, the physics of the Persephone began to betray him. The pressure creep had begun. It was a subtle, terrifying shift in the rig's structural integrity. Usually, the 4 concrete legs of the platform were filled with a precise mixture of air and seawater to maintain buoyancy and ballast. But as the things from the deep climbed the legs, they weren't just using the surface for grip. They were infiltrating the intake valves. Arthur reached the main deck and felt the tilt. It was no longer 2 degrees. The horizon line through the bridge windows was angled sharply. The rig was listing to port, dipping its alpha leg deeper into the churning North Sea. "They're filling the tanks," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. "They're using their own biomass to displace the air. They're turning the rig into a sinker." He knew he couldn't stop them from entering the legs. The intake vents were 60 feet underwater, guarded by heavy steel grates that were designed to keep out kelp and fish, not a sentient, pressurized sludge that could mimic the properties of water. His only hope was to retreat to the core, the central, pressurized hub of the rig that housed the master logic and the emergency life support systems. This was a safe room, a titanium-reinforced cylinder located at the very heart of the superstructure. It was designed to withstand a blowout or a total structural collapse for up to 72 hours. Arthur moved with the methodical speed of a man who had practiced his emergency drills 1,000 times. He bypassed the main corridors, which were already slick with the gray, prehistoric silt that smelled like ancient rot and wet copper. He took the C pipe, a narrow utility crawl space used for manual inspections of the electrical conduits. Inside the crawl space, the sounds of the rig were magnified. He could hear the steel screaming, the high-pitched, metallic groan of girders being twisted under a load they were never designed to carry. Every few seconds, a deep thrum echoed through the pipe, a vibration so powerful it vibrated the fillings in his teeth. "The derrick is acting as a lever," Arthur muttered to himself, his flashlight beam dancing across the bundles of wires. The weight of the spore tower on the Goliath is creating a sympathetic resonance. If I don't decouple the main bus bars, the Persephone will snap in half before she even sinks. He reached the core's primary hatch. It was a 3-foot-thick plug of hardened steel, operated by a manual hydraulic hand pump. Arthur grabbed the lever and began to pump. Up, down, up, down. The hydraulics hiss, the fluid moving slowly in the cold. He could hear the maintenance crew outside the crawl space. Their movements weren't the frantic footsteps of humans. It was the sound of heavy, wet sacks being dragged over metal. Squelch, thump, squelch. They were close. The hatch finally groaned open. Arthur slid inside and slammed it shut, spinning the heavy locking wheel until the steel pin seated into the bulkhead with a final, satisfying clunk. The silence inside the core was absolute. It was a sterile, white-painted room filled with the hum of the only functioning electronic system left on the rig, the Master Logic server. This computer didn't run on the main power grid. It was powered by a dedicated RTG, a radioisotope thermoelectric generator, a small nuclear decay battery that would last for 20 years. Arthur slumped against the server rack, his chest heaving. The white light of the room felt violent after days of green glow sticks and gray fog. He looked at the main monitor. The screen wasn't showing the rig's diagnostics. It was showing a map of the world. The blue nodes were everywhere. It wasn't just the North Sea. There were points of light blooming off the coast of Brazil, in the Gulf of Mexico, and along the Japanese shelf. Every deep-water oil rig in the world was being converted. The spore towers were rising in unison, a global network of biological antennas. "It's a terraforming event," Arthur said, his voice echoing in the small room. He moved to the console and began a deep system override. As an engineer, he had access to the Scuttle Command, a last resort protocol designed to prevent the rig from falling into the wrong hands or causing an environmental disaster. If he triggered it, the ballast tanks would blow their seals, the legs would detach, and the Persephone would drop into the 4-mile-deep trench beneath her. But the Master Logic was resisting him. System error. External load detected. The screen flickered. The signal had found the core. The dit-dit-dash began to play through the server's internal speakers. Arthur didn't panic. He opened the floor panel, revealing the nerve center, a dense forest of fiber optic cables that connected the computer to the rest of the rig. He saw the intrusion immediately. A thin, translucent filament, like a strand of spider silk, had grown through the air intake vent and was wrapped tightly around the primary data bus. It was drinking the data. It was learning the Scuttle Command. "Not on my watch," Arthur hissed. He didn't use a knife. He used a soldering iron. He knew that the filament was a conductor of both biological and electrical signals. He set the iron to its maximum temperature, 800 degrees, and touched it to the filament. The reaction was instantaneous. The filament shriveled, turning a bright, angry orange. A surge of feedback traveled back through the vent, followed by a wet, guttural scream that seemed to come from the very walls of the rig. Arthur used a moment to lock out the external sensors. He blinded the rig. He cut the fiber optic lines one by one, manually isolating the core from the rest of the Persephone. He was amputating his own brain to save his thoughts. Once the last cable was severed, the screen stabilized. Local control restored. Arthur sat back, his hands shaking. He looked at the scuttle button. It was a physical switch under a red plastic cover. All he had to do was flip it. But then he looked at the secondary monitor, the one connected to the internal CCTV of the safe room corridor. The gym suit, the guest, was standing directly outside his hatch. It wasn't trying to break in. It was holding something up to the camera. It was a tablet, a standard issue company tablet, Sarah's tablet. On the screen, a video was playing on a loop. It was a recording from the first night of the blackout. It showed Miller and Sarah. They weren't being attacked. They were standing on the gantry, looking out at the dark ocean with expressions of profound peace. They weren't fleeing the great quiet. They were welcoming it. Miller looked at the camera, his eyes reflecting the blue light from the water. "Arthur," he said, his voice distorted by the recording. "The pressure is gone. You don't have to fight the weight anymore. The Ethel Guard is waiting. Just open the ballast. Let the ocean in. It's not a drowning, Arthur. It's an integration." The video ended. The gym suit lowered the tablet. Then it did something that chilled Arthur more than any scream. It knocked. Clink, clink, clink. A rhythmic, polite knock. 3 times. The signature of a man who knows the person on the other side is home. Arthur looked at the scuttle switch. Then he looked at the hatch. The pressure creep was intensifying. He could feel the floor beneath him groaning as the alpha leg began to buckle under the weight of the water being pumped into it. The rig was dying, but it was being reborn as something else, a part of the bloom. He realized then that the integration wasn't a choice for the world. It was a physical certainty. The spore towers were already releasing their seeds into the jet stream. By tomorrow, the signal would be in every drop of rain that fell on the planet. He reached for the radio on the console. It was a short-range, hardwired unit that only reached the exterior speakers of the rig. "Miller?" Arthur asked, his voice steady. "If I open the hatch, if I let the ocean in, does the noise stop? The hum? Does it go away?" The gym suit tilted its helmet toward the speaker. The green CRT face flickered. "The noise is a resistance," the screen scrolled. "Cease the resistance. Become the conductor." Arthur looked at his hands. The hands of a man who had spent his life fighting against rust, against leaks, against the inevitable decay of machines. He was tired of the noise. He was tired of the cold. He walked to the scuttle switch. He didn't flip it to sink the rig. He flipped it to override. He didn't sink the Persephone. He opened the ballast vents to their maximum capacity. He didn't just let the water in. He invited it. The sound that followed was the most terrifying and beautiful thing Arthur had ever heard. It was a sound of 50,000 tons of steel surrendering to the deep. The creaking stopped. The screaming stopped. There was only the roar of the North Sea rushing into the hollow legs, a massive hydraulic sigh of relief. Arthur walked to the hatch. He didn't wait for the gym suit to break in. He gripped the locking wheel and began to turn. "Physics doesn't change," Arthur whispered as the seal broke. "But the medium does." The water didn't burst in like a flood. It flowed in like a thick, glowing blue silk, filling the room from the floor up. It was warm. It was pressurized. And as it reached Arthur's knees, he didn't feel the cold. He felt the signal. He felt the Goliath. He felt the coast of Scotland. He felt the billions of miles of fiber optic cables under the sea, all of them pulsing with the same heartbeat .1. The gym suit stepped into the room, its mechanical hand reaching out toward him. Arthur didn't pull away. He took the hand. The transition was not the violent, lung-crushing trauma Arthur had spent his career fearing. As the Persephone completed its controlled descent, slipping beneath the surface of the North Sea, like a giant settling into a cold bed, the laws of terrestrial engineering simply ceased to apply. Within the core, the bioluminescent water rose past Arthur's chest, his throat, and finally his eyes. He expected the instinctive, thrashing panic of the drowning man, but the signal acting upon the water had changed its viscosity. It felt like being encased in warm, liquid glass. The gym suit, still gripping his hand with its mechanical claws, stood motionless as the room reached neutral buoyancy. Arthur's vision didn't fail. Instead, the blue light of the water acted as a new kind of lens. He could see the structural lattice of the rig through the walls, not as steel and concrete, but as a map of stress and potential energy. The resistance is gone, he thought. He didn't speak the words. He felt them resonate through the fluid. The submerged state was a revelation of technical efficiency. For 30 years, Arthur had fought the ocean, building walls and pumps to keep the pressure out. Now, as part of the bloom, he realized that the pressure was the power source. He began to move through the rig, no longer climbing ladders, but drifting through the open conduits. His body felt weightless, his movements guided by the rhythmic pulse of the dit-dit-dash that was now the very tempo of his heartbeat. His first task as engineer of the bloom was to oversee the connection. The Persephone had come to rest on a subterranean shelf, 2,000 feet down. The drill string, once a rigid pipe, had softened into a flexible, translucent umbilical cord. Arthur drifted toward the moon pool, which was now a gateway to the abyss. Looking down, he saw the seafloor. It was no longer a desert of silt and rock. It was a glowing neural network. Thousands of miles of fiber-optic cables, the original nervous system of the human world, had been reclaimed. The gray organisms from the deep had wrapped themselves around the cables, using the glass cores to transmit biological data at the speed of light. The rigs were the nodes. The processing centers where the data from the deep was converted into the spore towers that were now reaching for surface. Arthur reached the main control room of the life support deck. The monitors were all dark, but he didn't need them. He touched the main console, and his mind was flooded with a flow. He could feel every valve on the rig, every structural bolt, every microscopic leak. But he wasn't fixing them to keep the water out. He was adjusting them to let the life fluid circulate more efficiently. Flow rate, for 1,000 liters per second. Pressure, 300 atmospheres. Status, optimal. He moved toward the spore chamber, what used to be the rig's primary storage hold. It was now filled with thousands of pulsating, translucent pods. Inside, each one was a human form, the missing crews of the North Sea rigs. He saw Miller. He saw Sarah. They weren't dead. They were in a state of biotic stasis, their nervous systems being used as biological coprocessors for the global network. They're the RAM, Arthur realized, the engineering analogy coming naturally to him. The human brain is the only thing in the world with the complexity to manage a network of the scale. He felt a flicker of his old self, a ghost of the man who had spent his life protecting people from machine. He looked at Sarah, her hair drifting in the blue water like kelp. She looked peaceful, her mind a part of collective consciousness that stretched from the Arctic to the Mariana Trench. But then he felt the disruption. A vibration was coming from the surface. It wasn't the natural rhythm of the wind or the waves. It was a sharp, percussive sound. Bang, bang, bang. Arthur tuned his awareness toward the surface. High above, where the spore tower rose from Persephone's derrick into the air, something was attacking. A fleet of automated salvage drones, remnants of the old world's military-industrial complex, had detected the bloom. They were programmed to destroy any anomaly on the resource platforms. The drones were dropping depth charges. The first explosion rocked the rig. The shockwave traveled to the water with terrifying speed, hitting Arthur like a physical blow. The signal in the water fractured, turning from a rhythmic pulse into a chaotic scream of static. Threat detected. Node 01 under attack. The network pulsed through Arthur's mind. He didn't think about the politics of the old world or the monsters of the new one. He only thought about the system. The Persephone was under his care. The Bloom was his new machine, and he was the only one who knew how to shield it. He drifted toward the ballast distribution manifold. If he could overpressurize the lower legs, he could create a silk cloud, a massive eruption of seafloor mud that would act as a physical and electronic shield against the drone sensors. It was a delicate maneuver if he pushed the pressure too high. The concrete legs would explode. If he was too slow, the next depth charge would shatter the spore chamber. Arthur gripped the manual bypass levers. They were coated in the blue sludge, but they still obeyed his touch. He began to pump the pressure, using the rhythmic pulse of the signal to time his movements. Push, hold, release. Push, hold, release. He was no longer just an engineer. He was a part of the rig's hydraulics. He could feel the tension in the concrete, the way the steel groaned under the added load. "Come on, you old bucket of rust," he whispered into the fluid. "Hold together for me." A second depth charge detonated closer this time. The glass in the control room shattered, the shards drifting harmlessly in the thick water. Arthur didn't flinch. He pushed the final lever. From the base of Persephone, a titanic wall of gray silt erupted. It wasn't a random cloud. Arthur had shaped it using the rig's thrusters, creating a perfect acoustic dampening dome around the structure. The signal inside the dome stabilized instantly. The drones above lost their lock. Their sensors, designed to track metal and heat, couldn't pierce the wall of ancient, pressurized mud. They circled aimlessly for an hour before their fuel ran low and they returned to whatever dark, automated hangars they had come from. Arthur slumped against the manifold, his energy depleted. The network pulsed with a sense of gratitude, a warm, low-frequency hum that vibrated through his bones. "Integration complete," the signal whispered. "Node 01, permanent." Arthur looked up at the spore chamber. The pods were glowing brighter now, their violet light filling the room. He realized that he wasn't just a technician anymore. He was the heart of the Persephone. He was the bridge between the old physics and the new biology. He drifted toward a vacant pod at the center of the room. It was shaped exactly for a man of his build. The translucent silk of the pod's walls reached out for him, inviting him into the final stage of the great quiet. Arthur looked at his hands one last time. They were no longer stained with grease and salt. They were clean, glowing with a soft blue light. He had spent his life fixing things that were destined to break. Now, he was part of something that would never die. He stepped into the pod. The transition was a final, perfect seal. The signal became his only thought, a vast, beautiful harmony of billions of minds working in unison. He could see the whole world now, the glowing spore towers rising like a new forest across the planet, the blackout finally giving way to a new violet dawn. As his eyes closed for the last time as a human, Arthur's final thought was one of technical satisfaction. "The load is balanced," he whispered into the deep. "The system is stable." The transition was not a finality, but a prolonged, agonizingly slow calibration. Arthur had been inside the safe room for what the Master Logic's RTG clock estimated to be 14 days, though the concept of day had become a theoretical abstraction. The Persephone had reached its final resting depth on a continental shelf, wedged into a forest of ancient, jagged rock 3,000 feet below the surface. The pressure outside the titanium hull was now approximately 1,300 pounds per square inch, a weight so immense that the very molecules of the steel seemed to be huddling together for warmth. Arthur was not dead, but he was no longer functioning in a way any medical manual would recognize. The blue fluid, the life fluid, had filled the room entirely. It had replaced the air in his lungs, but it didn't burn. It was highly oxygenated and thick, a liquid lung bypass that felt like breathing cold mercury. He sat in the center of the room, his body tethered to the server racks by hundreds of fine, translucent filaments that had grown out of the guest's hand. He was an engineer in a web. System check, Arthur thought. The thought didn't stay in his head. It traveled to the filaments and appeared as a line of green text on the flickering monitor in front of him. Node status. Pending. Ballast. 100% saturated. Structural integrity. 42% and degrading. The horror of Arthur's situation was the technical clarity of it. He could feel the pressure creep in a way he never had before. He spent hours, or perhaps years, in the accelerated processing time of the network, analyzing the infinitesimal microscopic shifts in the titanium hull. He could feel a single rivet on the far side of the level 3 gantry beginning to yield to the sheer force of the deep-sea currents. He felt the cold, dark water licking at the edges of the seals he had replaced only weeks ago. Every groan of the rig was a physical sensation. When a support girder buckled under the weight of the encroaching silt, Arthur's own ribs felt as if they were being compressed by an invisible vice. He was no longer a man using a machine. He was a machine's nervous system, and the machine was being slowly crushed into a cube of scrap. But the signal, the dit-dit-dash, was no longer coming from the radio. It was coming from the water itself. It was a physical pulse, a rhythmic expansion and contraction of the ocean that vibrated to the hull and into his bones. Through the rig's external hydrophones, which were now his ears, Arthur could hear the world above. It was the sound of a mechanical extinction. He heard the rhythmic thud-thud-thump of the other rigs, the Goliath, the Deepwater Nine, as they too scuttled themselves, dropping into the dark one by one like a slow-motion rain of steel. He heard the spore towers collapsing as they reached their peak height, shedding their biological payloads into the jet stream. They aren't building a forest, Arthur realized, the data flowing through his mind like a cold current. They're building a blanket, a planetary-scale heat sink. He used the rig's remaining long-range optics, cameras that were now shielded by a thick, protective layer of the gray silt, to look at the surface. The North Sea was no longer gray or blue. It was a shimmering, iridescent violet. The bloom had covered the water from horizon to horizon, a layer of biological matter, so thick it had calmed the waves. The ocean had become a single, giant, pulsating organ. And then the input changed. The master logic began to receive data bursts from the mainland. Arthur felt the arrival of the signals. They were coming from the automated coastal stations, weather buoys, lighthouse sensors, and port authorities. They were the dying screams of a digital civilization. Location, Aberdeen status. Offline, location, London status. Offline, location, Oslo status. Signal terminated. The world wasn't being conquered by a monster. It was being decommissioned by a superior architect. The bloom was systematically shutting down every power grid, every satellite uplink, and every radio tower it could find. It was stripping the planet of its electronic noise, creating a silent Earth. Why? Arthur thought, a flicker of his old, human curiosity sparking through the blue fluid. The answer came not in words, but in a frequency map. The gym suit, still standing motionless in the corner of the room, flickered its CRT face. It showed a map of the solar system. The signal wasn't just staying on Earth. The spore towers were acting as massive parabolic reflectors, focused on a single point in the dark between the stars. Earth was no longer a home. It was a beacon. The bloom was a technical upgrade to the planet's communication capacity, turning the globe into a giant biological radio telescope. Where the antenna, Arthur whispered in his mind, the concept both terrifying and mathematically elegant. The whole world, for a billion years of evolution, just to send a message to someone else. He looked at his hands. The skin was translucent now, the veins pulsing with the same violet light as the server racks. He could see the individual cells of his body being optimized. The life fluid was replacing his carbon-based chemistry with something more durable, a silicon-protein hybrid that could survive the Great Quiet for centuries. But as his humanity faded, the engineer in him began to notice the flaws in the Bloom's plan. The Persephone was an old rig. It was never meant for the pressures of the abyssal zone. The life fluid was maintaining his body, but it couldn't stop the laws of physics. The titanium hull of the safe room was designed for a safety factor of 1.5, and the gauges were already showing they had hit 1.48. Arthur began to perform a frantic, internal calculation. He tried to talk to the Bloom to warn it that the node was failing. "The ballast seals are at 98% capacity," he signaled. "The structural harmonics are creating a resonance that will shatter the central column. If the core fails, the message will be interrupted." The signal didn't care. On the 22nd day, the pressure creep hit a critical threshold. The alpha leg, the one Arthur had tried to save with his solar panels and his welding torch, finally buckled. The sound was a titanic, underwater explosion of concrete and rebar. The rig shifted violently, tilting another 15 degrees into the silt. Warning: structural collapse imminent. Arthur felt the scream of the steel. He felt the rivets popping like gunshots along the length of his own spine. He looked at the gym suit. The suit didn't move to help him. It simply watched, its green screen scrolling a final message. Load limit reached. Sacrificial node engaged. The Bloom wasn't a savior. It was an engineer. And in any complex system, some parts are sacrificial. The Persephone had served its purpose. It had transmitted its data. It had seeded its sector. And now, it was no longer required for the system's stability. It was an expired asset. Arthur felt the signal begin to withdraw. It was like a warm blanket being ripped away in a freezing room. The vast, beautiful harmony of the billions of minds in the network started to fade, leaving him with the cold, raw sensation of the water and the crushing, lonely weight of the abyss. The filaments connecting him to the server racks began to wither and snap, their blue light dying as they turned to gray ashen fluid. No! Arthur thought, a sudden, sharp surge of human terror breaking through the calm. Don't leave me in the dark. Not now. I'm still functional. I can fix it. He tried to move his arms, but they were heavy, pinned by the pressure that was now leaking through the microcracks in the hull. The gym suit screen flickered one last time, a jagged green line that looked like a flatlining heartbeat, and went black. The RTE battery in the master logic, designed to last 20 years, suddenly short-circuited as a life fluid turned caustic, its purpose served. The white lights of the core died. Arthur was left in the absolute, crushing darkness of the North Sea floor. He was still integrated. He could still feel the rig, but he was no longer part of the flow. He was just a man in a drowning box, 3,000 feet below the world. He didn't die instantly. His optimized body didn't need to breathe, and the life fluid kept his heart beating in a slow, agonizing rhythm of once every 60 seconds. He was trapped in the safe room, a titanium coffin that refused to break, even as it groaned under the weight of the world. He sat there, staring into the blackness. He could hear the ocean outside, the slow creak of the rig as it settled deeper into the mud. He could hear the faint, distant hum of the other nodes, far away and indifferent to his silence. He was a forgotten component in a global machine. He reached out his hand, touching the cold, wet wall of the core. He found a piece of metal, a fallen bolt from the ceiling. He began to tap against the titanium. Clink, clink, clink. He wasn't sending a signal. He wasn't trying to be rescued. He was just an engineer, performing the last task he knew, checking the integrity of the wall, listening for the change in pitch that would mean the pressure had finally found its way in. The great quiet had finally arrived for Arthur. It was long, it was dark, it was perfectly, terrifyingly open-ended. Somewhere high above, the violet sea was silent, its surface a glassy, biological mirror. And somewhere in the dark between the stars, a message was being received, a message paid for the silence of a world. But for the keeper in Persephone, there was only the cold, the dark, and the slow, rhythmic tapping of a man who had fixed everything but his own obsolescence. The master logic's last flickering thought was a line of code Arthur had written decades ago, during his first week as a trainee. End of log. No further entries expected. Arthur closed his eyes and continued to tap. The rig groaned in response, a final metallic sigh as the silt began to cover the windows, burying Persephone and its lonely engineer in the soft, gray embrace of the deep.